This brief video will cover some of the major points related to the World Bank. The World Bank operates on very similar principles to the IMF. It is an interstate organization that pools its members' resources and considers requests for loans. The organizational structure of the bank is also similar to that of the fund. So the World Bank is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Its members include 189 countries that are members of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The mandate is to reduce poverty by lending money of rich countries to poor countries for specific development projects and by providing technical assistance to poor countries. The key structures of the World Bank include assets of $275 billion based on contributions of members, $59 billion in loans and credits in the 2009 financial year by the institutions of the World Bank, and also bonds that are backed by its capital in order to raise money for lending. The key obligations include that all members contribute to the common pool of resources. Those who borrow agree to the terms of the loan, which may include policy changes. Enforcement involves the fact that borrowing becomes part of the sovereign debt of the borrower and must be repaid according to the rules of sovereign debt payments. The World Bank Group, as it is formally known, makes several financial instruments available to the states that join as members. These instruments are largely variations on the theme of opportunities for the member government to borrow money from the institutions of the World Bank Group. These are managed by separate entities within the group under distinct legal arrangements. The core institution in the group is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It is what we commonly refer to as the World Bank, and this is the main focus of this PowerPoint. The other bodies were added over the years to expand the ways that the bank can become more involved in national development strategies. For example, the International Finance Corporation was created in 1956 to organize financing for private development programs, a type of loan that is expressly forbidden to the IBRD. The International Development Agency, created in 1960, raises its own money from rich members and lends it at highly favorable rates to the poorest and most indebted countries. The World Bank Group is directed by the Board of Governors, who are typically the finance or development ministers of the member states. Each member has a representative on the Board of Governors, and it meets in a large regular session once per year. In between these formal meetings, the operative decisions on loan and other financing, as well as interpreting the articles of agreement and setting bank policies, are made by a body known as the Executive Directors. This is a body of 25 members. The 5 largest shareholders in the bank each have an automatic seat. They are the United States, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and France. The remaining seats are allocated among quasi-regional groupings of member states such that every member is represented by an executive director, though likely not one of their own citizens. The executive directors strive to operate by consensus, but when formal votes are taken, they are weighted by countries' subscriptions to the organization. The bank draws its legal mandate from its Articles of Agreement. The Articles of Agreement define the bank as a kind of corporate partnership owned through a system of shares held by the members in proportion to their investments in the joint enterprise. These investments include original subscriptions made upon joining the organization, as well as periodic increases in its capitalization. Members are obligated to purchase shares upon joining the organization, and this stock of investment funds the bank's lending, akin to the contributed capital of a firm. There are about 1.5 million shares in existence, of which the United States owns the most, about 265,000 shares, followed by Japan, Germany, France, and the UK. The shares are not tradable on any market, and the Articles of Agreement forbid countries from selling their shares to anyone other than the bank itself. 20% of the value of a country's shares must be paid upfront in gold or in US dollars upon joining. This is the initial subscription. The rest must be made available to the bank in various currencies upon request by the bank. Since it deals across currencies, fluctuations in the relative values of these currencies produce interesting effects in the life of the bank. Most of its assets are held in US dollars or in dollar-denominated securities, and so declines in the US dollar manifest themselves as automatic reductions in the wealth of the bank and perhaps in its ability to lend. Declines in other currencies may mean that the subscriptions of those countries are worth less than to the bank than previously, though perhaps with a consequent rise in the relative value of its dollar holdings. Article 2(9) of the Articles of Agreement describes the possibility of a mandatory infusion of cash by a country whose currency has declined greatly, somewhat like a margin call for an investor. So this is like calling your debts due as a lender. And this money provides the capitalization of the bank, and the bank uses it as collateral for its own borrowing from international financial markets. The core of the bank's lending happens through the IBRD, and its operations are limited by the Articles of Agreement to loans for the purpose of specific projects of reconstruction or development. This is crucial to understand the bank's role in international development and its distinction from the IMF. The bank is engaged in project-specific lending, and those projects must fit under the heading of reconstruction or development. Countries initiate projects by approaching the bank with a proposal regarding a development project for which it seeks funding. From there, a negotiation takes place between the government and the bank officials over the nature of the project, the terms of the loan, and other details. Other parts of the World Bank Group may lend to private actors, but the IBRD lends only to states and to borrowers for whom a state is willing to provide guaranteed backing. States are given quite a long time to pay off these loans, at least 30 years, and often the bank insists that the borrower finds other funding partners to supplement the bank's contribution so that their risk is diversified. The bank's political controversies arise both over the way it grants loans and over the terms of those loans. The bank has operated under a number of overarching concepts since 1947, and these define distinct periods in its history. These are usually the result of the president's worldview regarding how best to work toward the organization's goals. The period under Robert McNamara, from the late 1960s through the 1980s, is generally thought of as characterized by attention to meeting the basic needs of poor people, in contrast with the previous period where the bank favored very large construction projects with a more openly anti-communist agenda. In the 1980s, this shifted to a concern with funding the structural adjustment of borrowing countries' economies to integrate with the international market, and with an emphasis on the private sector. The current period is defined by the Millennium Development Goals set at the 2000 UN Summit, including sustainability, basic health care, and partnership with other international organizations. Like the IMF, the World Bank relies on states' concerns with their future borrowing as the lever to induce them to repay their loans. It has no capacity, legal or otherwise, to access government accounts to force them to repay their loans. The bank's technique of enforcing its rules by limiting future lending may, however, sometimes amount to an idle threat, and there are many ways that the power relationship between borrower and lender might become inverted. For instance, a half-funded project may be difficult to cancel even if the borrower shows signs of reneging on its promises. Half a bridge contributes little to local welfare, and the bank may be inclined to press on to a finished project even if the borrowing country has made unilateral changes that displease the bank. In other cases, the borrower may have a powerful patron at the bank such that it is unlikely that future loans really are dependent on past performance. The U.S. has often used its influence over the bank to ensure a flow of loans to governments that it favors. The problem of corruption within and outside the World Bank introduces an even more interesting dynamic. And this is an important concern to the bank, and it has found when it does research that there is quite a bit of stealing and dishonest behavior surrounding these loans. For example, in Indonesia alone, there is an estimated 1/3 of the 30 billion that was borrowed by the Suharto regime between 1967 and 1998 that was diverted to the personal enrichment of members of that regime. And this appears to be about the normal rate of corruption of World Bank loans. By one estimate, about 10 billion of missing money lost in Indonesian loans was stolen with the full knowledge of the bank, largely because the bank was directed by the U.S. to continue lending to the Suharto government despite these losses. This reflects in part the way the bank has been used during the Cold War as well as after as an instrument to sustain governments which Washington favored. But it raises an important legal question: should the people of Indonesia be legally liable for funds lent by the bank and stolen by its leaders? The sovereign debts of the country are the responsibility of the country as a corporate actor and persist regardless of changes in government. They are taken on by leaders but must be repaid by the country and its population. Corruption by the government amounts to a violation of the terms of that agreement, and this would be considered criminal debt. So there is an ongoing controversy and question about who should be responsible for this missing money.